Listen carefully, Netanyahu. You condemned my military takeover in Burkina Faso as an undemocratic coup destroying stability across our 54 African nations. You believed your blood-soaked government had moral authority to judge African leaders, and you could lecture me about seizing power through force. You watched Western nations condemn my coup while staying silent about your 58 years occupying Syrian land stolen in 1967. This is my final warning. I'm destroying your moral authority permanently. Every speech I make exposes your 58-year occupation while you condemn my 3-year governance, and I deliver crushes your credibility across our 54 nations, and you cannot stop what's coming. Let me tell you exactly what happened. I seized power in Burkina Faso on the 30th of September 2022, overthrowing the transitional government led by Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, who himself had taken power through military coup in January 2022. My military takeover was the second coup in Burkina Faso within 8 months, a pattern that alarmed Western powers, regional organizations, and international observers who condemned what they portrayed as democratic backsliding and instability threatening West African security. Within hours of my takeover, statements condemning the coup emerged from the United States, France, the European Union, the African Union, and the Economic Community of West African States. These condemnations emphasized that military seizures of power were unacceptable violations of democratic norms, that Burkina Faso must return to constitutional order, and that the international community would not recognize governments emerging from coups. Your government joined this chorus of condemnation with particular enthusiasm. Israeli officials issued statements expressing concern about political instability in Burkina Faso and calling for restoration of democratic governance. Israeli media portrayed my takeover as evidence of African political dysfunction and authoritarianism. Israeli diplomatic communications emphasized that Israel supports democratic transitions and opposes military coups as violations of international norms. Your government positioned itself as defender of democracy and constitutional order, lecturing me about the illegitimacy of seizing power through military force rather than democratic elections. Listen. The staggering hypocrisy of your government condemning my military takeover while defending and maintaining military occupation of Syrian Golan Heights for 58 years. I seized power in Burkina Faso, our sovereign territory, where Burkinabe people live, to remove a government that failed to protect Burkinabe civilians from jihadist violence and failed to deliver security and sovereignty our populations demanded. My military takeover affected Burkinabe governance within Burkinabe borders. Your government has militarily occupied Syrian Golan Heights, Syrian sovereign territory, for 58 years since capturing it during the 1967 war. Israeli military forces control Syrian land, Syrian resources, and Syrian strategic territory, despite Syria never consenting to Israeli rule, and despite international law declaring the occupation and annexation illegal. The comparison exposes your hypocrisy completely. You condemn me for seizing power in my own country to remove a failed government, a takeover that affected only Burkinabe governance within Burkinabe territory. But you defend and maintain military occupation of another nation's sovereign territory for 58 years, an occupation that denies Syria control over its own land, violates Syrian sovereignty, and was condemned as illegal when your government annexed Golan Heights in 1981. You lecture me about the illegitimacy of military seizure of power, while your government seized Syrian territory through military force and maintains control through military occupation for nearly 6 decades. I'm telling you, the fundamental difference between my coup and your occupation demonstrates why your condemnation is fraudulent. My military takeover occurred within Burkina Faso's sovereign territory, removed a Burkinabe government that failed Burkinabe people, and was supported by Burkinabe populations who celebrated the removal of leadership that couldn't deliver security. Your occupation involves Israeli military forces controlling Syrian territory outside Israel's internationally recognized borders, denying Syria sovereignty over its own land, and maintaining control despite Syrian opposition and international condemnation. My coup was internal political change within one nation. Your occupation is foreign military seizure and control of another nation's territory maintained through force for nearly 6 decades. The duration comparison is particularly damning. I've governed Burkina Faso for approximately 3 years as of 2025. You've occupied Syrian Golan Heights for 58 years since 1967. You condemned my 3-year governance established through coup as illegitimate and undemocratic while defending your 58-year occupation of Syrian territory as necessary security arrangement. The absurdity of this position is obvious. If military seizure of power is illegitimate because it violates democratic consent and sovereignty, then your military occupation of Syrian territory for nearly 6 decades while denying Syria control over its own land is exponentially more illegitimate than my 3-year governance of Burkina Faso. Your condemnation of my coup emphasized that power must derive from legitimate authority rather than military force. But Syria never consented to Israeli occupation of Golan Heights. Israeli forces seized control of Syrian territory through military conquest in 1967 and maintained that control through military force and illegal annexation in 1981 despite Syrian demands for return of occupied territory. If legitimate authority is the standard determining governmental control, the standard you invoked when condemning my coup, then Israeli occupation of Syrian Golan Heights is completely illegitimate because Syria never agreed to Israeli control, never recognized Israeli sovereignty over Golan, and never consented to Israeli annexation declared illegal by United Nations Security Council Resolution 497 inches 1981. Listen, how your government's rhetoric about my coup contradicted your policies regarding Syrian Golan Heights. Israeli officials condemned my coup as violation of sovereignty and democratic norms, yet Israeli occupation of Syrian Golan Heights violates Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity. Israeli statements emphasize that military force cannot legitimately establish governmental authority, yet Israeli authority over Golan Heights derives entirely from military conquest and annexation rather than Syrian consent or international recognition. Israeli communications stress that international community must not recognize governments established through force. Yet Israeli government demands international recognition of its annexation of Golan Heights despite UN Security Council, declaring that annexation null and void with no legal validity. The hypocrisy extends beyond just the occupation to Israeli exploitation of Syrian resources in occupied Golan Heights. While condemning my coup, your government simultaneously exploited Syrian water resources, Syrian agricultural land, and Syrian strategic territory for Israeli benefit without Syrian consent. Golan Heights provides approximately 1/3 of Israel's water supply through control of sources feeding the Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee. Israeli settlers cultivate Syrian agricultural land growing crops and raising livestock on territory that belongs to Syria. Israeli military uses Golan's strategic elevation overlooking Damascus and southern Syria for surveillance and military positioning. Your government profits from occupation of Syrian territory while condemning me for taking power in my own country. Israeli settlements in occupied Syrian Golan Heights expanded under your leadership despite the occupation and annexation being illegal under international law. When you served as prime minister, Israeli settler population in Golan Heights grew from approximately 20,000 settlers to over 25,000 by 2024. These settlements involve occupying Syrian land, using Syrian water resources, and creating permanent Israeli presence on Syrian territory designed to prevent Golan's return to Syrian sovereignty. Your government facilitated this settlement expansion through financial incentives, infrastructure development, and military protection, all on occupied Syrian territory in violation of international law, prohibiting occupying powers from transferring civilian population into occupied territories. So you condemned my coup affecting Burkinabe governance within Burkinabe borders, while simultaneously maintaining illegal occupation of Syrian territory and facilitating Israeli settlement on occupied Syrian land. The contrast could not be starker. I removed a failed government in my own country with support from my population, while you occupy another nation's sovereign territory over that nation's sustained opposition and in violation of international law. Yet you portrayed my actions as illegitimate violence threatening regional stability while defending your occupation and annexation of Syrian territory as necessary security measures and legitimate Israeli sovereignty. This double standard exposes that your concern isn't actually about military force or legitimate authority, it's about who exercises power and whether they serve Western and Israeli interests. The security justifications your government offered for maintaining occupation of Golan Heights, parallel justifications. Damiba's government offered for its failures justifications I rejected when seizing power. Damiba's government claimed it needed time to address security threats from jihadist groups before restoring democratic governance. Your government claims Israeli occupation of Syrian Golan Heights is necessary security measure protecting Israel from threats originating in Syria. I rejected Damiba's security justifications because 8 months proved insufficient progress and because his government's approach fundamentally failed to deliver security Burkinabe populations desperately needed. Yet you maintain occupation of Syrian territory for 58 years, over 87 times longer than Damiba governed, while claiming security justifications still apply, despite decades proving occupation perpetuates regional tensions rather than resolving them. Listen. How security justifications for occupying Syrian territory mirror authoritarian justifications for indefinite emergency rule. Authoritarian governments across our 54 African nations and globally claim they need extended power and suspended normal processes to address security threats, terrorism, insurgency, external threats, instability. Democratic advocates, including Israeli officials, typically condemn these justifications as pretexts for maintaining power indefinitely while avoiding accountability. Yet Israeli occupation of Syrian Golan Heights operates under essentially identical logic. Security threats require military control of Syrian territory, Syrian sovereignty must be denied until threats are eliminated, and occupation must continue indefinitely because security situation never improves sufficiently to return occupied territory to Syrian control. The difference is that African governments face international pressure to address security challenges through means other than indefinite emergency rule, while Israeli occupation of Syrian territory continues indefinitely with Western support, despite security justifications proving invalid after 58 years. If security threats don't justify African governments suspending normal governance for decades, why do security justifications allow Israeli military occupation of Syrian territory for nearly 6 decades? If African leaders claiming security necessities must eventually restore normal order, regardless of remaining threats, why doesn't Israel face similar demands to end occupation of Syrian territory regardless of claimed security concerns? The answer is obvious. Western powers and Israel apply different standards to African governance versus Israeli occupation of Syrian territory because they believe Syrian sovereignty matters less than Israeli security. Your government's condemnation of my coup emphasized that military takeovers undermine regional stability and set dangerous precedents for our 54 African nations. Yet Israeli occupation of Syrian Golan Heights has contributed to Middle East instability for 58 years, fueled Syrian-Israeli tensions, complicated regional peace efforts, and set precedent for territorial conquest through military force. The Israeli occupation of Syrian territory has been an obstacle to Syrian-Israeli peace negotiations for decades. Syrian government consistently demands return of occupied Golan Heights as prerequisite for any peace agreement with Israel. Israeli refusal to return occupied Syrian territory perpetuates state of conflict and prevents normalization of Syrian-Israeli relations. Israeli annexation of Golan Heights violated international law prohibiting acquisition of territory by force, setting precedent that military conquest can establish permanent control despite international legal prohibitions. If regional stability and respect for international norms are the standards your officials invoked when condemning my coup, then Israeli occupation and annexation of Syrian Golan Heights deserve far more severe condemnation than my military takeover in Burkina Faso. My coup affected Burkinabe governance and created regional concerns about democratic backsliding, but hasn't involved seizing another nation's territory, hasn't violated international legal prohibitions on territorial acquisition by force, and hasn't perpetuated international conflict for 6 decades. Israeli occupation has done all these things, yet receives Western support and your government's defense rather than the condemnation. Western and Israeli officials directed at my takeover. This proves your concern isn't regional stability or respect for international norms, but rather whether military actions serve or threaten Israeli and Western interests. The timeline comparison is devastating for your credibility. You condemned my coup after I governed for days and weeks before I had opportunity to demonstrate whether my governance would succeed or fail in delivering security and sovereignty Burkinabe populations demanded. Yet you defend occupation of Syrian territory after 58 years, more than enough time to demonstrate that occupation doesn't achieve stated security objectives and instead perpetuates regional tensions and international supported restoring condemnation. By any reasonable standard, policies maintained for 58 years despite failing to achieve stated objectives deserve condemnation far more than governments judged after brief periods. But your government rushed to condemn my coup while defending occupation of Syrian territory that's lasted nearly 6 decades, proving your judgments are based on political calculations rather than principled evaluation of legitimacy, effectiveness, or compliance with international law. I'm governing Burkina Faso with popular support from Burkinabe populations who celebrated Damiba's removal and who support my government's policies, including expelling French military forces, partnering with Russia for security cooperation, and pursuing genuine sovereignty over Burkinabe affairs. Burkinabe people support my governance because I'm delivering security improvements against jihadist threats, asserting sovereignty against foreign interference, and prioritizing Burkinabe interests over Western demands. Opinion surveys, public demonstrations, and absence of significant domestic opposition show substantial Burkinabe support for my government's direction, despite Western and regional condemnation of how I came to power. This popular support provides legitimacy that formal democratic processes alone cannot guarantee, especially when previous democratically elected governments failed to deliver security and sovereignty populations desperately needed. Syria has demanded return of occupied Golan Heights through every available diplomatic and political means for 58 years. Syrian government never accepted Israeli occupation or annexation as legitimate, never recognized Israeli sovereignty over Golan Heights, and consistently demanded return of occupied territory as Syrian sovereign land. Syria pursued diplomatic negotiations, international legal challenges, UN resolutions, and regional diplomatic pressure demanding Israeli withdrawal from occupied Golan Heights. Syrian resistance to occupation, though less visible than military resistance, demonstrates through sustained diplomatic opposition that Israeli control over Golan Heights lacks Syrian consent and violates Syrian sovereignty. Every Syrian demand for return of Golan Heights proves that Israeli occupation is maintained through force against Syrian will rather than exercised with Syrian acceptance. So I govern with popular support from Burkinabe populations who chose to back my leadership despite unconventional path to power, while you maintain occupation of Syrian territory over Syria's sustained opposition and diplomatic demands for return of occupied land. Yet you condemn my governance as illegitimate coup while defending your occupation of Syrian territory as necessary and legitimate Israeli control. This contradiction exposes that your standard for legitimacy isn't consent or popular support, it's whether control serves Israeli and Western interests. You defend occupation lacking Syrian consent because it serves Israeli security interests and provides strategic territorial advantages. You condemn my governance despite Burkinabe's support because it challenges Western and French interests in West Africa and asserts African sovereignty, rejecting Western dominance. The international law comparison is equally damning. My coup violated no international law because internal political changes within sovereign nations aren't governed by international legal prohibitions. International law addresses relations between states, territorial sovereignty, and state conduct, not how states internally organize their governments or how leaders come to power within sovereign territories. Regional organizations like the African Union have policies discouraging coups across our 54 African nations, and the Economic Community of West African States impose sanctions, but these are political and regional responses rather than violations of international law triggering international legal consequences. My takeover may have violated Burkinabe constitutional procedures and regional norms against coups, but it didn't violate international law in ways comparable to territorial occupation and annexation. Israeli occupation and annexation of Syrian Golan Heights violates multiple fundamental principles of international law according to United Nations Security Council resolutions and international legal consensus. UN Security Council Resolution 497, adopted in 1981, declared Israeli annexation of Syrian Golan Heights null and void with no international legal validity, demanded Israel rescind its annexation decision, and affirmed that acquisition of territory by force is inadmissible under international law. The UN Charter prohibits acquisition of territory through military force, yet Israeli control of Golan Heights derives from military conquest in 1967 and annexation in 1981. International humanitarian law prohibits occupying powers from permanently annexing occupied territories, yet Israel declared Golan Heights Israeli sovereign territory despite international rejection. Syrian territorial sovereignty and integrity are protected under international law, yet Israeli occupation denies Syria control over its own territory for 58 years. So my coup violated regional norms and Burkinabe constitutional procedures, but not international law, while your occupation and annexation of Syrian territory violates international law according to UN Security Council resolutions and fundamental international legal principles. Yet you condemned my actions while defending yours. This proves your rhetoric about international law and legal order is complete hypocrisy. You invoke international norms when they serve Israeli interests by condemning African coups. You violate international law when it constrains Israeli interests by occupying and annexing Syrian territory, despite Security Council declaring annexation null and void. You lecture others about respecting international legal order while violating that order when it conflicts with Israeli territorial and security interests. This selective application of international law destroys any moral authority your government might claim when judging other nations' actions. Listen. How Israeli control over occupied Syrian Golan Heights involves systematic violations beyond just the occupation and illegal annexation. Israeli authorities demolished Syrian villages when occupying Golan Heights in 1967, displacing over 100,000 Syrian residents who fled or were expelled during and after the war. Israeli government prevented these Syrian refugees from returning to their homes and lands in occupied Golan Heights, violating their right to return to their property. Israeli military and settlers exploit Syrian water resources from Golan Heights, providing substantial portion of Israel's water supply while denying Syria access to water sources on Syrian sovereign territory. Israeli authorities apply Israeli law to occupied Golan Heights, despite international law prohibiting occupying powers from extending their legal systems to occupied territories. Israeli settlements transfer Israeli civilian population into occupied Syrian territory in violation of Geneva Conventions prohibiting such transfers. These violations occur systematically across 58 years, affecting Syrian territorial sovereignty, Syrian refugees' rights, and Syrian natural resources, all documented by United Nations agencies, international legal bodies, and human rights organizations. The scale, duration, and systematic nature of violations under Israeli occupation of Syrian territory exceed any violations occurring in Burkina Faso under my governance by orders of magnitude. I haven't occupied another nation's territory. I haven't displaced hundreds of thousands of people from their homes and prevented their return. I haven't exploited another nation's natural resources for Burkinabe benefit. I haven't annexed foreign territory in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. Yet you condemned my coup while maintaining occupation, producing all these documented violations for 58 years. The sovereignty violation represented by the Israeli occupation of Syrian Golan Heights is particularly hypocritical given your condemnation of my coup. You condemned my military takeover, emphasizing that it violated Burkinabe's sovereignty and constitutional order, suggesting that how nations internally organize their governments matters to the international community. But Israeli occupation of Syrian Golan Heights violates Syrian sovereignty far more fundamentally than my coup violated any international principle, because occupation denies Syria control over its own territory, while my coup only changed who governs within Burkinabe's sovereign territory. If sovereignty and territorial integrity matter the principles invoked when condemning African coups, then Israeli violation of Syrian territorial sovereignty through 58 years of occupation deserves condemnation exponentially more severe than my internal takeover within Burkinabe borders. I'm exposing your hypocrisy not just to defend my governance, but to destroy Western and Israeli moral authority to lecture our 54 African nations about democracy, sovereignty, and international law. Every time Western or Israeli officials criticize African coups or African governance, I will cite this comparison. You condemned my 3-year governance established through internal coup while defending 58-year occupation of Syrian territory violating international law according to UN Security Council resolutions. Every time Western media portrays African political instability as evidence of African dysfunction, I will reference decades of Middle East tensions driven by Israeli occupation of Syrian and other territories Western powers support. Every time Western politicians claim moral authority based on respect for sovereignty and international law, I will highlight their support for Israeli occupation denying Syrian territorial sovereignty for nearly 6 decades in violation of international legal prohibitions. This constant exposure of Western and Israeli hypocrisy serves strategic purpose of eroding their ideological legitimacy across our 54 African nations. The perception that Western and Israeli positions represent universal principles rather than particular interests. As African populations and leaders recognize that Western and Israeli condemnations of African governance reflect double standards rather than principled commitments to sovereignty and international law, Western and Israeli capacity to influence African politics through moral authority collapses. African leaders become less responsive to Western criticism because they understand it's politically motivated rather than based on consistent principles. African populations become less receptive to Western narratives about governance and stability because they recognize Western hypocrisy, supporting occupations lasting decades while condemning African internal changes. Western and Israeli soft power in Africa declines as their ideological legitimacy is exposed as fraudulent. The comparison between my coup and Israeli occupation of Syrian territory also challenges African leaders across our 54 nations who condemned my takeover while maintaining relations with Israel despite its occupation policies. Some African governments condemned my coup, emphasizing respect for sovereignty and international law, yet these same governments maintain diplomatic and economic relations with Israel despite its illegal occupation and annexation of Syrian Golan Heights in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. This inconsistency reveals that many African leaders prioritize maintaining good relations with Western powers and Israel over applying consistent principles regarding sovereignty, territorial integrity, and international law. These leaders condemned my coup because Western powers wanted them to, not because they genuinely oppose all violations of sovereignty or all military seizures of territory. I'm challenging these African leaders directly. If you condemned my coup because it violated sovereignty and established authority through force, then you must condemn Israeli occupation of Syrian territory imposed through military force for 58 years. If you emphasize that international law and norms must be respected, then you must acknowledge that the UN Security Council declared Israeli annexation of Golan Heights null and void with no legal validity. If you claimed my coup threatened regional stability, then you must recognize that Israeli occupation has contributed to Middle East instability for nearly 6 decades. If you supported sanctions against my government for internal political changes, then you must support pressure on Israel for violating Syrian territorial sovereignty and international legal prohibitions on territorial acquisition by force. Listen, the specific African leaders I'm challenging by name. President Macky Sall of Senegal condemned my coup, emphasizing constitutional order and regional stability, yet Senegal maintains diplomatic and economic relations with Israel, including military cooperation agreements, despite Israeli occupation of Syrian Golan Heights violating Syrian sovereignty for 58 years. President Alassane Ouattara of Ivory Coast supported ECOWAS sanctions against Burkina Faso for my coup, yet Ivory Coast accepts Israeli intelligence training and security partnerships while remaining silent about Israeli violations of UN Security Council Resolution 497 declaring annexation of Golan Heights illegal. President Nana Akufo-Addo of Ghana emphasized respect for democratic processes when criticizing my takeover, yet Ghana maintains friendly relations with Israel, including trade agreements and diplomatic exchanges, despite Israeli denial of Syrian territorial sovereignty through permanent woke occupation. I'm demanding these leaders explain their double standards publicly. How do you justify condemning my 3-year governance of Burkina Faso while maintaining partnerships with Israel occupying Syrian territory for 58 years? How do you reconcile supporting sanctions against Burkina Faso for internal governance changes with accepting Israeli violations of UN Security Council resolutions prohibiting territorial acquisition by force? How do you claim to defend sovereignty principles when condemning African coups while ignoring Israeli denial of Syrian sovereignty over occupied Golan Heights? Your silence on Israeli occupation while vocally condemning my coup exposes that you apply different standards to African governance versus Israeli actions, revealing you prioritize maintaining good relations with Israel and Western powers over consistent application of sovereignty and international law principles. These African leaders fear Western and Israeli pressure more than they fear their own population's judgment. They condemned my coup because Western powers and ECOWAS wanted them to, not because they genuinely believe all military seizures of power are illegitimate regardless of circumstances. They remain silent about Israeli occupation because condemning Israel would anger Western allies and potentially cost them Israeli security partnerships and Western diplomatic support. They calculate that Western approval matters more than consistent principles, prioritizing relationships with powerful nations over solidarity with Syria suffering occupation or with Burkina Faso pursuing genuine sovereignty against Western bus and pressure. But this calculation is failing because African populations increasingly recognize their leaders' hypocrisy and increasingly demand leaders who consistently defend sovereignty and oppose all occupations regardless of Imi's perpetrator's identity. Senegalese, Ivorian, and Ghanaian populations who supported their leaders' condemnations of my coup are now questioning why those same leaders remain silent about Israeli occupation of Syrian territory. Pan-African civil society organizations are highlighting this inconsistency, demanding African leaders explain their double standards, and calling for consistent application of sovereignty principles, including condemnation of Israeli occupation. Young Africans on social media are exposing their leaders' hypocrisy, comparing condemnations of African coups with silence on Israeli violations of Syrian sovereignty, and demanding leaders prioritize African principles over Western approval. This growing popular pressure will force African leaders to choose: maintain inconsistent positions favoring Western interests and face domestic legitimacy challenges, or adopt consistent principles condemning all sovereignty violations, including Israeli occupation, and face Western diplomatic pressure. Either choice weakens Western influence leaders maintaining hypocrisy, lose legitimacy with populations demanding consistency, while leaders adopting principled positions, rejecting Israeli occupation, reduce Western capacity to use moral authority for influencing African policies. My challenge to these African leaders therefore serves strategic purpose beyond just exposing their inconsistency. It creates political dynamics, forcing them toward positions that advance African sovereignty and reduce Western ideological dominance across our 54 nations. African leaders who condemned my coup while ignoring Israeli occupation of Syrian territory reveal they apply different standards to African internal governance versus Israeli violations of another nation's sovereignty, implicitly accepting that Syrian territorial rights matter less than maintaining good relations with Israel and Western powers. This acceptance of double standards perpetuates the same colonial mentality that allowed European powers to violate African sovereignty across our 54 nations. The belief that different rules apply to powerful nations versus weaker nations, that Western and Israeli interests justify violations that would be condemned if committed by African or other non-Western nations. African leaders must reject these double standards by demanding consistent application of international law and sovereignty principles, condemning all military occupations, all illegal annexations, and all violations of territorial integrity, regardless of perpetrator's identity or power. My governance of Burkina Faso prioritizes Burkinabe's sovereignty, security, and dignity objectives I'm achieving despite Western condemnation and regional pressure. I expelled French military forces that operated in Burkina Faso for years without eliminating jihadist threats or respecting Burkinabe's sovereignty, asserting Burkinabe control over our security rather than accepting indefinite French military presence. I partnered with Russia for military cooperation, providing training, equipment, and intelligence. Burkinabe forces need to combat jihadist groups more effectively than Western partners delivered. I rejected IMF loan conditions that would have required austerity measures harming Burkinabe populations to satisfy Western financial institutions' demands. I'm building genuine Burkinabe sovereignty, where my government determines policies based on Burkinabe interests rather than Western or French dictates. These achievements vindicate my decision to seize power from Damiba's failing government, demonstrating that my coup served Burkinabe interests rather than personal ambition or authoritarian impulses your government implied when condemning my takeover. Burkinabe security has improved as our forces, trained by Russian advisors, achieve successes against jihadist groups that eluded forces trained by French and American partners for years. Burkinabe's sovereignty has strengthened as we expelled foreign military forces, asserted control over our resources and policies, and rejected Western conditions on our governance. Burkinabe dignity has been restored as we refuse subordination to French and Western demands, standing proudly as sovereign African nation determining our own path. These tangible improvements provide legitimacy my governance possesses, regardless of whether Western and Israeli officials recognize it. Compare these achievements to results of 58 years of Israeli occupation of Syrian Golan Heights. Has occupation delivered lasting security to Israel? Regional tensions with Syria persist, and occupation itself creates ongoing security concerns requiring permanent military presence. Has occupation advanced peace? Syrian-Israeli relations remain hostile with no peace agreement possible while Israel occupies Syrian territory. Syria demands be returned. Has occupation enhanced Israel's international standing? Israel faces international condemnation for occupation and faces UN Security Council resolutions declaring its annexation illegal and invalid. Has occupation benefited Syrian populations whose territory is occupied? Over 100,000 Syrian refugees displaced from Golan Heights remain unable to return to their homes and lands for 58 years. By any reasonable measure, Israeli occupation of Syrian Golan Heights has failed to achieve lasting positive outcomes while perpetuating violations of Syrian sovereignty and international law, yet continues with your government's defense. The fundamental difference is that I'm governing Burkina Faso to serve Burkinabe interests within our sovereign territory, and I'm achieving results demonstrating progress toward security and sovereignty objectives. You're maintaining occupation of Syrian territory, supposedly serving Israeli security interests. Yet after 58 years, occupation demonstrably fails to deliver lasting security, regional peace, or international legitimacy while violating Syrian sovereignty and international law. I've governed for 3 years and delivered security improvements, expelled foreign forces, and strengthened sovereignty within Burkinabe territory. You've occupied Syrian territory for 58 years while regional tensions persist, peace remains impossible, and international condemnation continues. Yet you condemned my governance as illegitimate while defending your occupation as necessary. This comparison proves your judgments reflect political bias favoring Israeli interests rather than objective assessment of legitimacy, effectiveness, sovereignty, or compliance with international law. Stop the hypocrisy, Netanyahu. You condemned my military takeover in Burkina Faso after I governed for weeks before I could demonstrate my governance would deliver security and sovereignty. Yet you defend military occupation of Syrian Golan Heights after 58 years, more than enough time to prove occupation violates Syrian sovereignty without achieving lasting peace or security. You lectured me about force not legitimately establishing authority while maintaining occupation of Syrian territory imposed through military conquest in 1967 and illegal annexation in 1981. You emphasized respect for international law when condemning my coup while violating UN Security Council resolutions, declaring your annexation of Golan Heights null and void with no legal validity. Listen, the timeline hypocrisy that destroys your credibility completely. You condemned my governance after weeks, literally days after I seized power on September 30, 2022, before any reasonable observer could assess whether my government would succeed or fail in delivering the security and sovereignty Burkinabe populations demanded. Your condemnation came so quickly it was obvious you weren't evaluating my governance based on results or effectiveness, but purely based on the fact that I took power through military force rather than elections. You gave me no opportunity to prove my governance would work, no chance to demonstrate I could deliver what previous governments failed to achieve, no time to show that my coup served Burkinabe interests rather than personal ambition. Yet you defend occupation of Syrian Golan Heights after 58 years, over 21,000 days, over 3,000 weeks, nearly 6 decades of military control over Syrian sovereign territory. If weeks were insufficient time for you to withhold judgment on my governance, then 58 years is more than sufficient time to judge that your occupation of Syrian territory is catastrophic, failure that violates Syrian sovereignty without delivering the lasting security or regional peace you claim justifies, continued occupation. After 58 years, every possible justification for occupation has been tested and proven invalid. After 58 years, the temporary security arrangement excuse becomes permanent territorial theft. After 58 years, the claim that occupation will eventually lead to peace becomes obvious lie, concealing intentions to maintain permanent control over stolen Syrian land. The contrast in your timeline judgments exposes pure political bias rather than principled evaluation. You rushed to condemn my governance before it could be fairly assessed because condemning African military takeovers serves Western interests in maintaining compliant African governments. But you defend 58-year occupation despite overwhelming evidence it violates international law and Syrian sovereignty because occupation serves Israeli strategic and territorial interests regardless of its illegality or its failure to achieve stated security objectives. Your different timeline standards for African governance versus Israeli occupation prove you don't actually care about legitimacy, effectiveness, or results. You only care whether power serves or threatens Israeli and Western interests. I'm telling you what those 58 years of occupation actually achieved versus what your government claims. Your government claims occupation of Golan Heights is necessary security measure protecting Israel from threats originating in Syrian territory. But after 58 years of occupation, has Israeli security improved permanently? No. Israel still faces regional security threats, still maintains massive military presence in occupied Golan, still cannot achieve peace agreement with Syria because Syria demands return of occupied territory. Your government claims occupation prevents Syria from using Golan's strategic elevation to threaten Israeli territory. But after 58 years, has this military control produced regional stability or lasting peace? No, Syrian-Israeli relations remain hostile, regional tensions persist, and occupation itself perpetuates conflict by denying Syria its sovereign territory. What occupation actually achieved after 58 years is Israeli control over Syrian water resources, providing 1/3 of Israel's water supply, Israeli settlement of over 25,000 Israeli civilians on occupied Syrian land, Israeli exploitation of Syrian agricultural territory, and Israeli strategic military positioning on Syrian sovereign territory, all maintained through military force, despite Syrian demands for return of occupied land and despite UN Security Council resolutions declaring Israeli annexation illegal. These are the real achievements of 58 years of occupation: resource theft, land colonization, and territorial expansion, not security or peace. Your occupation serves Israeli territorial and resource interests while violating Syrian sovereignty, which is why you defend it despite its duration, proving its permanent theft rather than temporary security arrangement. Compare this to what I've achieved in 3 years governing Burkina Faso. I've delivered measurable security improvements as Burkinabe forces trained by Russian advisors achieved successes against jihadist groups that eluded forces trained by French and American partners for years. Jihadist attacks in areas where our forces operate declined as we deployed more effective tactics and equipment. Burkinabe civilian confidence in security improved as populations saw government forces achieving results previous governments failed to deliver. These security improvements aren't complete. Jihadist threats persist, and we continue fighting, but progress in 3 years exceeds what previous governments achieved in longer periods with Western military support. I've expelled French military forces that operated in Burkina Faso for years without eliminating jihadist threats or respecting Burkinabe's sovereignty. French troops are gone. Burkina Faso controls its own security without foreign military presence dictating our operations or limiting our sovereignty. This expulsion represents fundamental shift from decades of French military presence that Burkinabe populations resented and that failed to deliver security despite French claims their forces were essential for fighting jihadists. I proved French presence wasn't necessary by achieving security improvements after their departure through partnerships with Russia and through Burkinabe determination to control our own defense. I've strengthened Burkinabe's sovereignty by rejecting IMF loan conditions requiring austerity measures that would have harmed Burkinabe populations to satisfy Western financial institutions. Burkina Faso determines economic policies based on Burkinabe interests rather than IMF dictates fundamental sovereignty. Previous governments sacrificed by accepting Western loan conditions limiting policy independence. I've asserted control over Burkinabe natural resources, ensuring they serve Burkinabe development rather than primarily benefiting Western corporations. I've built partnerships with Russia, China, and other non-Western powers, providing alternatives to Western dominance and reducing Western leverage over Burkinabe policies. These achievements in 3 years, security improvements, expulsion of foreign forces, strengthened sovereignty, diversified partnerships demonstrate my governance is succeeding in core objectives despite your premature condemnation. You condemned my coup before I could prove it would work. 3 years later, it's working, delivering security and sovereignty previous governments failed to achieve. Meanwhile, your 58-year occupation of Syrian Golan Heights continues failing to deliver lasting security or peace while violating Syrian sovereignty and international law. Yet, you condemned my successful 3-year governance while defending your failed 58-year occupation. This proves your judgments have nothing to do with effectiveness or legitimacy and everything to do with protecting Israeli interests regardless of results or legality. I govern Burkina Faso with popular support from Burkinabe populations within our sovereign territory. You occupy Syrian sovereign territory over Syria's sustained opposition and diplomatic demands for return of occupied land. I've delivered security improvements, expelled foreign forces, and strengthened sovereignty in 3 years. You've maintained occupation for 58 years while violating Syrian territorial integrity, displacing over 100,000 Syrian refugees, and facing international condemnation. Yet you condemned my governance as illegitimate coup, while defending your occupation as necessary and legitimate. Listen, the legitimacy comparison that exposes your double standards. I govern Burkina Faso with demonstrable popular support from Burkinabe populations who celebrated Damiba's removal when I seized power and who continue supporting my government's policies and direction. Public demonstrations in Ouagadougou and other Burkinabe cities showed thousands of Burkinabe citizens celebrating my takeover and expressing support for my government's sovereignty-focused agenda. Opinion surveys, admittedly limited in conflict zones but still indicative, show majority Burkinabe support for expelling French forces, partnering with Russia, and pursuing genuine sovereignty, even if that means confronting Western powers. The absence of significant domestic opposition or resistance movements against my government indicates substantial popular acceptance, if not enthusiastic support. This popular support provides legitimacy that formal electoral processes alone cannot guarantee, especially when previous elected governments failed catastrophically to deliver security Burkinabe populations desperately needed. What good is electoral legitimacy if elected governments cannot protect populations from jihadist violence killing thousands of Burkinabe civilians? What value does democratic process have if democratically elected leaders subordinate national sovereignty to French interests rather than serving Burkinabe populations? Popular support based on delivering security and sovereignty provides more meaningful legitimacy than elections that produced governments failing their fundamental responsibilities to protect populations and defend national interests. You occupy Syrian Golan Heights over Syria's absolute and sustained opposition, expressed through 58 years of diplomatic demands, UN resolutions, and consistent refusal to recognize Israeli sovereignty over occupied Syrian territory. Syria never accepted Israeli occupation as legitimate, never recognized Israeli annexation as valid, never agreed to Israeli control over Syrian land, and never stopped demanding return of Golan Heights to Syrian sovereignty. Syrian government pursued every diplomatic and legal avenue available to challenge occupation, bringing cases to UN Security Council, seeking international legal determinations, conducting diplomatic campaigns, and maintaining official position that Golan Heights is occupied Syrian territory that must be returned. The contrast is absolute. I govern with popular support from populations within my sovereign territory you occupy over sustained opposition from the nation whose sovereign territory you control. If popular support and consent matter for legitimacy, the standards typically invoked by democratic advocates, then my governance possesses legitimacy through Burkinabe support, while your occupation lacks legitimacy due to Syrian opposition. Yet you condemned my governance as illegitimate coup while defending your occupation as legitimate control. This contradiction proves your standard for legitimacy isn't actually consent or popular support, it's whether control serves Israeli interests. You support occupation lacking Syrian consent because it serves Israeli territorial and resource interests. You condemn my governance despite Burkinabe support because it challenges Western interests in maintaining compliant African governments. I've delivered tangible results in 3 years that previous governments failed to achieve despite longer periods and more resources. Security improvements against jihadist groups that Western-supported governments couldn't deliver. Expulsion of foreign military forces that previous governments accepted indefinitely despite popular resentment. Strengthened sovereignty through diversified partnerships, reducing Western leverage that previous governments sacrificed through dependence on Western aid and French military support. These achievements demonstrate my governance is working, delivering what Burkinabe populations demanded and what justified my seizure of power from failing government. You've maintained occupation for 58 years while violating every principle you claimed when condemning my coup. You violated Syrian territorial integrity by occupying and annexing Syrian sovereign territory despite UN Security Council declaring annexation null and void. You displaced over 100,000 Syrian refugees from Golan Heights, who fled or were expelled during and after 1967 war, and who remain unable to return to their homes and lands for 58 years, creating permanent refugee population whose displacement violates their rights to return to their property. You face sustained international condemnation through UN resolutions, international legal determinations, and diplomatic opposition to occupation and annexation. You exploit Syrian water resources and agricultural land for Israeli benefit without Syrian consent and in violation of Syrian sovereignty over its natural resources. Yet you condemned my governance as illegitimate coup threatening stability while defending your occupation as necessary and legitimate, despite it producing all these violations over 58 years. The hypocrisy is absolute. You judge my 3 years by impossibly high standards while defending your 58 years, despite catastrophic failures to achieve stated objectives and despite massive violations of Syrian sovereignty and international law. This proves your condemnation of my coup was never about legitimacy, effectiveness, stability, or respect for sovereignty. It was purely political judgment supporting Israeli and Western interests, regardless of principles you claim to defend. This hypocrisy destroys any moral authority you claim when judging African governance across our 54 nations. Your condemnation of my coup while defending 58-year occupation of Syrian territory proves you apply double standards. Your violation of UN Security Council resolutions while lecturing about international law proves your rhetoric is fraudulent. Your denial of Syrian territorial sovereignty while condemning my internal governance proves you believe different rules apply to Israeli actions versus African sovereignty. Listen, how your hypocrisy destroys Israeli and Western moral authority to judge African governance. Moral authority to judge other nations' actions requires consistency, applying same standards to your own conduct that you apply to others. You cannot credibly condemn others for violations you commit yourself. You cannot legitimately lecture about principles you violate when convenient. You cannot maintain moral authority while practicing obvious double standards favoring your interests over consistent application of claimed principles. Your condemnation of my coup, while defending your 58-year occupation of Syrian territory, demonstrates such blatant inconsistency that any remaining Israeli moral authority to judge African governance collapses completely. Every time you or other Israeli officials criticize African coups, African governance, or African political instability, African leaders and populations will cite your 58-year occupation of Syrian Golan Heights as proof your criticism reflects double standards rather than principled commitments. When Israeli diplomats express concern about African military takeovers, we'll respond. You condemned Ibrahim Traore's 3-year governance while defending 58-year occupation of Syrian territory. You have no moral authority to judge African governance. When Israeli media portrays African political changes as evidence of dysfunction, we'll reference, your government occupies Syrian land for 58 years in violation of UN Security Council resolutions while condemning African internal changes. Your judgments are hypocrisy, not principle. This constant citation of your hypocrisy serves strategic purpose of destroying Israeli moral authority across our 54 African nations. As African leaders and populations recognize that Israeli condemnations of African governance reflect double standards rather than universal principles, Israeli capacity to influence African politics through moral authority disappears. African leaders become immune to Israeli criticism because they understand it's politically motivated rather than based on consistent standards. African populations reject Israeli narratives about African governance because they see Israeli hypocrisy supporting occupation while condemning African actions. Israeli soft power in Africa collapses as ideological legitimacy is exposed as fraudulent. Your violation of UN Security Council resolutions while lecturing about international law proves your rhetoric is completely fraudulent. UN Security Council Resolution 497, adopted in 1981, declared Israeli annexation of Syrian Golan Heights null and void with no international legal validity, demanded Israel rescind annexation, and affirmed that acquisition of territory by force is inadmissible. This wasn't advisory opinion or aspirational goal, it was binding Security Council resolution under UN Charter. Yet your government ignored this resolution completely, maintaining annexation despite Security Council declaring it illegal, continuing occupation despite prohibition on territorial acquisition by force, and defending actions Security Council explicitly condemned. You violated binding UN Security Council resolution for over 40 years, yet condemned my coup as violation of international norms. The contrast is absurd. My coup violated no UN Security Council resolution, no international legal prohibition, no binding international obligation. It violated regional norms and Burkinabe constitutional procedures, but not international law. Your occupation and annexation violate explicit UN Security Council resolution declaring your actions null and void. Yet you portrayed my actions as international threat, requiring condemnation while defending your violations of Security Council resolutions as legitimate Israeli policy. This proves your rhetoric about international law is pure hypocrisy. You invoke international norms when condemning others but ignore international law when it constrains Israeli actions. Every time you or Western allies lecture Africa about respecting international law, international institutions, or UN authority, African nations will cite your 40-plus years violating UN Security Council Resolution 497. When Israeli officials emphasize importance of international legal order, will respond, "You violated Security Council resolution declaring your annexation null and void for over 40 years. You destroyed your authority to lecture about international law." When Western powers claim UN authority must be respected, will reference, "You support Israeli violation of Security Council Resolution 497 while demanding African compliance with international norms. Your position is fraudulent hypocrisy." This constant exposure destroys Israeli and Western capacity to use international law rhetoric as tool for influencing African policies. Your denial of Syrian territorial sovereignty while condemning my internal governance proves you believe different rules apply to Israeli actions versus African sovereignty. Syria's territorial sovereignty over Golan Heights is recognized by entire international community except Israel and United States. Every other nation recognizes Golan Heights as occupied Syrian territory rather than Israeli sovereign land. UN Security Council affirmed Syrian sovereignty over Golan Heights. International Court of Justice principles on territorial sovereignty apply to Syrian territorial integrity. International law prohibiting acquisition of territory by force protects Syrian sovereignty over Golan Heights. Yet your government denies Syrian territorial sovereignty by annexing Golan Heights and treating it as Israeli territory despite universal international rejection of that annexation. You denied Syrian territorial sovereignty for 58 years, yet condemned my coup as violating Burkinabe sovereignty. My coup changed who governs within Burkinabe sovereign territory but didn't deny Burkinabe territorial sovereignty. Burkina Faso remains sovereign over Burkinabe territory regardless of how leaders come to power. Your occupation denies Syrian territorial sovereignty by controlling Syrian land, annexing Syrian territory, and treating Golan Heights as Israeli rather than Syrian sovereign territory. Yet you condemned my internal governance change as sovereignty violation while defending your denial of Syrian territorial sovereignty as legitimate Israeli control. This proves you believe Israeli actions are exempt from sovereignty principles applied to African nations' double standard, revealing racist assumptions that Syrian and African sovereignty matters less than Israeli territorial interests. This belief in different rules for Israeli actions versus African sovereignty is precisely the mindset that justified European colonialism across our 54 African nations. European colonizers believed their interests justified violating African sovereignty, seizing African territory, exploiting African resources, and denying African self-determination because they believed different rules applied to European powers versus African peoples. Your belief that Israeli interests justify occupying Syrian territory, denying Syrian sovereignty, and violating international law, prohibiting territorial acquisition by force while condemning African internal governance reflects identical mentality. The belief that powerful nations' interests justify violations that would be condemned if committed by weaker nations. African leaders and populations recognize this colonial mentality immediately because we experienced it for centuries. When you condemn African coups while defending Israeli occupation of Syrian territory, we hear same colonial logic that justified European occupation of African territory, the claim that our sovereignty matters less than powerful nations' interests. When you lecture about African governance while violating Syrian territorial sovereignty, we see same double standards European colonizers applied rules for thee but not for me. When you invoke international law to judge Africa while violating international law yourself, we recognize same hypocrisy. Colonial powers practiced using supposed moral superiority to justify domination while committing violations they condemned in others. This recognition destroys any remaining Israeli and Western moral authority across our 54 African nations. We reject your judgments because we understand they reflect colonial mentality rather than universal principles. We refuse your authority because we recognize your double standards serve your interests rather than promoting genuine respect for sovereignty and international law. We expose your hypocrisy because African liberation requires dismantling not just formal colonialism, but also mental colonization that made Africans accept Western and Israeli moral authority, despite their obvious hypocrisy and double standards. I'm exposing this to every African leader and population. Netanyahu condemned my 3-year governance while defending 58-year illegal occupation of Syrian territory. We reject your double standards. We refuse your authority. Your hypocrisy is exposed and we're done accepting your judgments. Listen. The strategic purpose of this exposure beyond just defending my governance. I'm not exposing your hypocrisy primarily to justify my coup or to defend my government against your criticism, though your hypocrisy does destroy any legitimacy your criticism might have possessed. I'm exposing your hypocrisy as part of broader strategic project to dismantle Western and Israeli ideological dominance across our 54 African nations by destroying the moral authority that sustains their capacity to influence African politics through pressure, criticism, and supposed moral superiority. Your condemnation of my coup while defending 58-year occupation provides perfect example, exposing Western and Israeli double standards example. I will deploy repeatedly to discredit future attempts to judge or pressure African governments. Every African leader facing Western or Israeli criticism can now cite this comparison to neutralize that criticism. When Western powers condemn African governance, African leaders respond. You condemned Traoré's 3-year governance while supporting Israeli 58-year occupation of Syrian territory. Your criticism reflects double standards, not principles. When Israeli officials lecture about democracy or stability, African governments respond. Netanyahu defended occupation violating UN Security Council resolutions while condemning African internal changes. Your authority to judge us is zero. When Western media portrays African political changes as dysfunction, African populations respond. You ignore Israeli violations of Syrian sovereignty while obsessing over African governance. Your narratives are propaganda, not journalism. This repeated citation of your hypocrisy gradually erodes Western and Israeli capacity to influence African politics through moral pressure. As more African leaders deploy this defense against Western criticism, Western officials will face choice: acknowledge their double standards and lose moral authority, or maintain hypocrisy and face constant exposure, destroying their credibility. Either choice weakens Western influence in Africa. Acknowledgement of double standards eliminates basis for future moral lectures, while persistent hypocrisy provides endless ammunition for African leaders exposing Western fraudulent moral authority. Over time, Western capacity to pressure African governments through criticism, sanctions, threats, or diplomatic isolation declines, as African leaders confidently reject Western moral authority and African populations support that rejection. I'm also exposing your hypocrisy to challenge African leaders who condemned my coup while maintaining relations with Israel despite its occupation of Syrian territory. Some African governments across our 54 nations condemned my takeover, emphasizing respect for sovereignty and constitutional order, yet maintain diplomatic relations with Israel, accept Israeli military and intelligence cooperation, and remain silent about Israeli occupation of Syrian Golan Heights in violation of Syrian sovereignty and UN Security Council resolutions. This inconsistency reveals these African leaders prioritize maintaining good relations with Israel and Western powers over applying consistent principles regarding sovereignty, territorial integrity, and international law. I'm demanding these African leaders explain their inconsistency. If you condemned my coup because it violated sovereignty principles, why don't you condemn Israeli occupation violating Syrian sovereignty? If you emphasized international law when criticizing my takeover, why do you ignore UN Security Council Resolution 497 declaring Israeli annexation null and void? If you claimed my actions threatened regional stability, why do you accept Israeli occupation that's destabilized Middle East for 58 years? If you supported ECOWAS sanctions against Burkina Faso for internal governance changes, why don't you support pressure on Israel for violating Syrian territorial integrity and international law? These African leaders cannot provide consistent answers because their condemnation of my coup while accepting Israeli occupation proves they apply double standards, favoring maintenance of good relations with Israel over principled application of sovereignty and international law standards. Their inconsistency exposes them as leaders who prioritize Western and Israeli approval over African principles and African solidarity. African populations observing this inconsistency increasingly question why their leaders condemned African leader pursuing sovereignty while maintaining friendly relations with Israel, occupying Syrian territory, questioning that undermines these leaders' legitimacy and strengthens populist movements demanding leaders who consistently defend sovereignty and oppose all occupations regardless of perpetrator. The exposure of your hypocrisy therefore serves multiple strategic objectives: defending my governance against your illegitimate criticism, providing weapon African leaders can use against Western pressure, destroying Western and Israeli moral authority across Africa, and challenging African leaders who apply inconsistent standards favoring Western interests. All these objectives advance broader goal of achieving genuine African sovereignty, where African nations determine policies based on African interests rather than Western approval, where African leaders fear popular accountability more than Western displeasure, and where African populations reject mental colonization, accepting Western moral authority despite obvious Western hypocrisy and double standards. We reject your double standards because accepting them perpetuates subordination to Western and Israeli power. If we accept that Israel can occupy Syrian territory for 58 years while condemning African governance changes, we're accepting that different rules apply to powerful nations versus African nations, accepting permanent inferior status, justifying continued Western domination. If we allow Western powers to judge African governance while ignoring Israeli violations of Syrian sovereignty and international law, we're granting them moral authority they don't deserve and that they'll use to pressure African governments serving African interests. If we remain silent when you apply double standards, we're complicit in maintaining a system where Western hypocrisy faces no consequences and where African sovereignty matters less than Western interests. We refuse your authority because recognizing it would legitimize your capacity to judge African governance despite your hypocrisy. Authority to judge requires moral standing consistency between principles claimed and actions taken. You lack moral standing to judge my governance because you defend 58-year occupation while condemning my 3-year governance, violate UN Security Council resolutions while lecturing about international law, and deny Syrian sovereignty while criticizing African governance. Refusing your authority isn't rejecting legitimate criticism, it's rejecting illegitimate judgment from hypocrites who apply standards to others they refuse to apply to themselves. Every African leader should refuse Israeli and Western authority to judge African governance until they demonstrate consistency by condemning all occupations, respecting all sovereignty, and complying with international law they demand others follow. Your hypocrisy is exposed, and we're done accepting your judgments, because accepting judgments from hypocrites perpetuates African subordination to Western power. For decades after independence, many African leaders accepted Western and Israeli moral authority despite obvious Western hypocrisy because they feared consequences of defying Western powers, needed Western aid and investment, or believed Western criticisms reflected legitimate concerns. But growing African confidence, emerging alternative partnerships with Russia and China, and increasing recognition of Western double standards are ending this acceptance. More African leaders now recognize that Western moral authority is fraudulent, that Western criticisms reflect political interests rather than universal principles, and that African sovereignty requires rejecting Western authority to judge African governance. I'm leading this rejection by explicitly refusing your authority, publicly exposing your hypocrisy, and demonstrating that defying Western criticism is viable and strategic. Other African leaders observing that Burkina Faso maintains stability and strengthens sovereignty despite refusing Israeli and Western moral authority will gain confidence to similarly reject Western judgments. As more African nations refuse Western authority, Western capacity to influence African politics through criticism and pressure collapses, accelerating African liberation from Western ideological domination and advancing genuine African sovereignty, where African nations determine their futures based on African interests rather than Western approval. The era of African leaders accepting Western and Israeli moral authority despite obvious hypocrisy is ending. We recognize your double standards, we refuse your illegitimate authority, we expose your hypocrisy constantly, and we're building African sovereignty that doesn't require your approval or fear your criticism. Your condemnation of my coup while defending 58-year occupation of Syrian territory provided perfect example, exposing your fraudulent moral authority example that will destroy Israeli and Western capacity to judge African governance through repeated citation by African leaders and populations rejecting your hypocrisy. Your moral authority across our 54 African nations is collapsing, and nothing you do can restore credibility you destroyed through decades of double standards and hypocrisy.